Can Africa reclaim its resources?
And Africa had a role to play. It has a role as a raw material producer. We will not allow sub-Saharan Africa to escape that. Okay, we do everything to keep sub-Saharan Africa where it is, also impoverished. It's absolutely vital for the prosperity of everyone else.
In the name of Africa being unable to manage its resources, the West controlled them. They took all the benefits, leaving Africa in poverty. But the time has changed. Burkina Faso is bringing change by reclaiming its gold mines. But still, the West says Burkina Faso won't be able to manage. Even if not, does that give the West the right to take control? Let's find out. Africa is no longer the silent observer in the global economy. It's stepping into the limelight with bold moves, sending shockwaves through the mining industry. Today, it's Burkina Faso that has thrown down the gauntlet, sending a message to the West that their days of plundering Africa's riches are coming to an end. In an act of defiance, Burkina Faso has nationalized two of its most lucrative gold mines, Boungou and Wagnion, which were previously controlled by Western corporations. While the mines were set to be sold for over $300 million, Burkina Faso has taken ownership for a mere $80 million, in a deal that also includes a 3% royalty on up to 400,000 ounces of gold. This move is more than an economic transaction. It's a signal that Africa is reclaiming control of its resources and no longer playing by the rules set by foreign powers. With Burkina Faso's nationalization shaking the foundations of the global gold market, let's begin by addressing the pressing question: why now? Why has Burkina Faso chosen this moment to nationalize its gold mines? The timing of Burkina Faso's nationalization of its gold mines is not a mere coincidence. It's a calculated move that reflects a shifting paradigm in Africa's approach to its natural wealth. For far too long, Africa has been exploited by Western powers who have dictated the terms of resource extraction, leaving the continent with environmental degradation and economic stagnation. But now, African nations are beginning to reclaim their agency, and Burkina Faso's move is an example of this growing trend. For decades, Western corporations have had a stranglehold on Africa's most valuable resources: gold, oil, diamonds, and rare minerals. These resources have been the lifeblood of Western economies, while African nations have been left with a mere fraction of the profits. But the winds of change are blowing across the continent, and countries like Burkina Faso are no longer content to play the role of resource providers for foreign powers. Burkina Faso's nationalization of the Boungou and Wagnion mines is a clear signal that the country is taking its destiny into its own hands. By paying just $80 million for assets that were previously valued at over $300 million, Burkina Faso has executed a strategic coup. The inclusion of a 3% royalty on future gold production only sweetens the deal, ensuring that the country will continue to benefit from its resources for years to come. But why now? The answer lies in the broader political and economic shifts taking place across Africa. There is a growing movement toward resource nationalism, a belief that African nations should control their wealth and not be beholden to foreign corporations. Countries like Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and South Africa have already begun to assert greater control over their resources, and Burkina Faso's decision to nationalize its gold mines is part of this larger trend. This movement is being driven by a combination of factors. First, there is a growing recognition among African leaders that the contracts signed with Western corporations in the post-colonial era were designed to benefit the West, not Africa. These contracts often locked African nations into exploitative arrangements that gave Western corporations control over vast swaths of land and resources while offering little in return. Second, there is a sense of urgency among African leaders to break free from the cycle of dependency that has plagued the continent for decades. Africa's vast resources have the potential to fuel economic growth and development, but only if they are managed by African nations themselves. By taking control of its gold mines, Burkina Faso is making a statement. Africa is no longer willing to be the playground of foreign powers. Finally, The rise of new global players like China and Russia is giving African nations more leverage in negotiations with the West. These countries are offering alternative sources of investment and expertise, allowing African nations to diversify their economic partnerships and reduce their reliance on Western corporations. In this context, Burkina Faso's nationalization of its gold mines is a logical step toward greater economic independence. While Burkina Faso's nationalization is a bold move that challenges the status quo, it also raises important questions about its impact on the global gold market. How will this shift in ownership affect global gold prices? And what does it mean for Western investors? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Gold has always been more than just a commodity. It's a financial haven that investors flock to during the times of uncertainty. So, when Burkina Faso nationalized two major gold mines, the global market was sent into alarm. The sudden shift in ownership is creating waves in an already sensitive market, and Western investors are scrambling to make sense of the new reality. Burkina Faso's decision to nationalize Bongo and Wagnion introduces an element of unpredictability that investors hate. The global gold market, while volatile, thrives on stability. Stability that has long been provided by Western-controlled operations in Africa. Now, with Burkina Faso taking control of two significant gold mines, that stability is in question. The first and most immediate impact is likely to be on global gold prices. With concerns about the continuity of production, investors are anticipating potential supply disruptions, which could push gold prices higher. The gold market operates on supply and demand, and any disruption in the supply chain can have significant effects on pricing. If Burkina Faso struggles to maintain the production levels that were previously achieved under Western management, the global supply of gold could tighten. This would create upward pressure on prices, as investors move to secure gold in anticipation of a shortage. But the concerns don't stop at supply disruptions. Western investors are also worried about the long-term implications of Burkina Faso's nationalization. For decades, Western corporations have controlled the gold supply coming out of Africa, and this control has allowed them to dominate the market. But now, with Burkina Faso in the driver's seat, that control is slipping away. If other African nations follow Burkina Faso's lead, it could lead to a significant realignment in the global gold market. Western corporations are already feeling the heat. The nationalization of Bongo and Wagnion could set a precedent for other African nations to reclaim control of their resources, and this possibility has investors on edge. For years, Western corporations have enjoyed favorable contracts that allowed them to extract Africa's wealth while offering little in return. But now, African nations are beginning to push back, and the implications for the global market are profound. There's also the issue of investor confidence. Western corporations have long been seen as the most reliable operators of gold mines in Africa. They have the expertise, the infrastructure, and the financial backing to ensure that production runs smoothly. But with African nations taking control, there's a perception, whether justified or not, that production levels could suffer. This perception is already causing jitters in the market, as investors question whether Burkina Faso can maintain the same level of efficiency as Western operators. Of course, the reality is that African nations are more than capable of managing their resources. Countries like Botswana and Namibia have successfully nationalized key industries and have seen significant economic growth as a result. Burkina Faso is simply the latest in a long line of African nations that are taking control of their resources and proving that they can manage them just as effectively as any Western corporation. But the fear among investors is real. They worry that if Burkina Faso's nationalization proves successful, other African nations will follow suit. This could lead to a significant reduction in Western influence over the global gold market, as African nations begin to dictate the terms of production and pricing. For the West, this is a nightmare scenario, one that threatens to undermine their dominance in the global economy. But could this be the beginning of a larger trend? Are we witnessing the start of a full-blown resource revolution across Africa? Burkina Faso's decision to nationalize its gold mines may seem like a localized event, but in reality, it's part of a much larger movement that is sweeping across Africa. For years, African nations have been trapped in exploitative contracts with Western corporations, contracts that allowed these corporations to extract vast wealth while offering little in return. But now, Africa is beginning to push back, and the nationalization of Bongo and Wanyan is just the latest example of this growing trend. This movement, known as resource nationalism, is based on the belief that African nations should control their resources and use them to benefit their people. It's a rejection of the colonial-era contracts that have kept Africa dependent on foreign powers, and it's a declaration of independence from the West's economic grip on the continent. Countries like Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and South Africa have already begun to assert greater control over their resources, and Burkina Faso's decision to nationalize its gold mines is part of this broader trend. These nations are no longer content to allow Western corporations to profit from their wealth while they remain impoverished. They want a fairer share of the profits, and they want to use their resources to fuel their economic growth. The rise of resource nationalism is being driven by several factors. First, there is a growing recognition among African leaders that the contracts signed with Western corporations in the post-colonial era were designed to benefit the West, not Africa. These contracts often gave Western corporations control over vast swaths of land and resources, while African nations were left with little more than environmental degradation and poverty. Second, there is a sense of urgency among African leaders to break free from the cycle of dependency that has plagued the continent for decades. Africa's resources have the potential to fuel economic growth and development, but only if they are managed by African nations themselves. By taking control of its gold mines, Burkina Faso is making a statement. Africa is no longer willing to be the playground of foreign powers. Finally, the rise of new global players like China and Russia is giving African nations more leverage in negotiations with the West. These countries are offering alternative sources of investment and expertise, allowing African nations to diversify their economic partnerships and reduce their reliance on Western corporations. In this context, Burkina Faso's nationalization of its gold mines is a logical step toward greater economic independence. But the implications of this movement go beyond Africa's borders. If more African nations follow Burkina Faso's lead, it could lead to a significant realignment in the global economy. Western corporations, which have long relied on cheap access to African resources, could find themselves sidelined as African nations begin to dictate the terms of resource extraction. This would represent a major shift in global power dynamics. For centuries, the West has dominated Africa, using its resources to fuel its economic growth. But now, Africa is beginning to push back, and the implications for the global economy are profound. If African nations succeed in reclaiming control of their resources, it could lead to a reconfiguration of global supply chains and a shift in the balance of power between the global North and the global South. With the rise of resource nationalism in Africa, the global power dynamics are beginning to shift. But how will the West respond to this challenge? The nationalization of Burkina Faso's gold mines is more than just an economic event. It's a geopolitical earthquake. For centuries, the West has dominated Africa, controlling its resources and using that wealth to fuel its economies. But now, Africa is pushing back, and the West is being forced to confront the possibility that it may no longer be able to exploit the continent as it once did. One of the key geopolitical implications of Burkina Faso's nationalization is the potential realignment of global alliances. For decades, African nations have been economically tied to the West, with Western corporations controlling the continent's most valuable resources. But now, with countries like China and Russia offering alternative sources of investment, African nations are beginning to look elsewhere for economic partnerships. China, in particular, has been making significant inroads in Africa, offering loans, infrastructure projects, and expertise in exchange for access to the continent's resources. Unlike the West, China has been willing to negotiate on more favorable terms, allowing African nations to retain greater control over their resources. This has made China an attractive partner for many African nations, and the rise of resource nationalism is likely to strengthen these ties. Russia, too, has been expanding its presence in Africa, particularly in the mining and energy sectors. With its expertise in resource extraction and its willingness to offer favorable deals, Russia is positioning itself as a key player in Africa's resource sector. As African nations begin to assert more control over their resources, they will likely continue to strengthen their partnerships with China and Russia, further diminishing the West's influence on the continent. But the West is unlikely to take the shift lying down. For centuries, Western powers have relied on Africa's resources to fuel their economies, and they are not going to give up that control without a fight. We've already seen instances of Western governments applying diplomatic and economic pressure on African nations that seek to nationalize their resources, and these tactics will likely continue. There's also the potential for military intervention. The West has a long history of using military force to protect its interests in Africa, and with the stakes this high, it's not out of the question that we could see a resurgence of military interventions aimed at securing access to Africa's resources. Whether through proxy wars, coups, or direct intervention, the West has shown time and again that it is willing to go to great lengths to protect its access to African resources. The rise of resource nationalism also has the potential to reshape global trade. As African nations take control of their resources, they may choose to prioritize trade relationships with other emerging powers, such as China and Russia, over their traditional ties to the West. This could lead to a realignment of global supply chains, with Africa playing a more central role in global resource markets. For the West, this is a nightmare scenario. The loss of control over African resources could lead to economic instability, as Western corporations are forced to renegotiate contracts and pay higher prices for the resources they once extracted cheaply. It could also weaken the West's geopolitical influence, as African nations align themselves with other global powers. As Africa begins to assert greater control over its resources, the geopolitical landscape is shifting. But with this newfound power comes significant challenges. Can African nations manage their nationalized resources effectively? Reclaiming control of resources is only the first step in Africa's journey toward economic independence. The real challenge for countries like Burkina Faso lies in managing these resources effectively. Nationalization is a powerful political statement, but it also comes with significant risks. If not managed properly, nationalization can lead to inefficiencies, corruption, and a decline in production, outcomes that could undermine the very goals it seeks to achieve. One of the biggest challenges African nations face in managing their nationalized resources is the lack of infrastructure and expertise. For decades, Western corporations have controlled the extraction, refining, and export of Africa's resources, and they have developed the infrastructure and expertise needed to do so efficiently. Now, with African nations taking control, they must build their capacity to manage these industries. This will require significant investment in infrastructure, education, and technology. African nations will need to develop the skills and expertise needed to operate complex industries like mining, oil extraction, and refining. They will also need to invest in the infrastructure required to transport and export these resources, such as roads, ports, and railways. Corruption is another major challenge. In many African nations, resource wealth has historically benefited a small elite rather than the broader population. This has led to widespread corruption and a lack of accountability in the management of resources. If nationalization is to truly benefit the people, African governments must take steps to ensure that the wealth generated from resources is used to develop the country's infrastructure, healthcare, and education systems, rather than being siphoned off by corrupt officials. Political stability is also a concern. The West has a long history of meddling in African affairs, and there is a real risk that they will attempt to destabilize African nations that seek to nationalize their resources. This could take the form of economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, or even military intervention. African nations will need to remain vigilant and work to strengthen their political institutions to withstand external pressure. Despite these challenges, there is reason for optimism. Many African nations have already demonstrated that they can successfully manage their resources. Countries like Botswana and Namibia have nationalized key industries, and have seen significant economic growth as a result. These nations have shown that with the right leadership and investment, African nations can manage their resources just as effectively as any Western corporation. Burkina Faso, too, has the potential to succeed. The country has already demonstrated its willingness to take bold steps toward economic independence, and, with the right investments in infrastructure and education, it can build the capacity needed to manage its gold mines effectively. If Burkina Faso can navigate the challenges ahead, it has the potential to become a model for other African nations seeking to reclaim control of their resources. Do you think it's the right time to reclaim resources? Will Africa be able to manage its resources? Let us know in the comments section. Do you see Burkina Faso writing history after this decision? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.